Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. Welcome to this special program about voting rights. Recent attempts to make it more difficult for you to vote and what you can do to help secure full electoral equality for all. Although usually portrayed as a direct, if too often delayed, march towards justice, America's path to voter equality has actually been winding and jagged. For each struggling step or two forward, powerful forces threaten to take us back. In the coming hour, we're going to show you how voter suppression, making it difficult or impossible to vote or to have all votes counted equally, is on the rise. We'll also hear from some top legal experts about crucial voting rights cases now being considered on both the state and federal level, including the highest court in the land, the United States Supreme Court. We'll talk with Arthur Eisenberg, legal director of the New York Civil Liberties Union, Donita Judge, senior attorney and program director of the Advancement Project's Power and Democracy program, and Deuel Ross, assistant counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. This joint production of Free Speech TV and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network is coming to you from the El Barrio Firehouse Studio in East Harlem, New York. Welcome. Before hearing from our guests, let's take a few minutes to get up to speed on the state of voting rights in America and a system that too often discourages citizens from voting at all. Why don't politicians and power brokers make it easier to vote? Why do some votes seem to count more than others? Are some laws supposedly meant to prevent voter fraud, preventing voting instead? And what's the best path forward for progressives concerned about voting rights in the run-up to this year's midterms?
It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country.
When President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, it was hailed as a giant step on the road to achieving equality for all. But decades later, our system remains broken and unequal.
The American voting system is busted. It's shattered.
Investigative reporter Greg Pallas.
Every 4 years, I become a crime reporter. The crime, election theft.
They're trying to take away your vote by saying you're not a citizen, by saying you voted in another state, by giving you provisional ballots for some cockamamie reason, by purging you from the voter rolls.
In our last election, 66 million Americans chose Hillary Clinton. 63 million picked Donald Trump. And 100 million didn't vote at all. More than half didn't even register.
For a nation that prides itself on its democracy, America hasn't made the act of voting particularly easy.
Why are we suffering from what journalist and humorist Mo Rocca calls electoral dysfunction? One reason? A patchwork of inconsistent voting rules applied independently by 3,067 counties and more than 13,000 voting districts.
We have different rules about who can register and who can't from state to state, and it's really not one America when it comes to voting.
Another reason? Voter suppression, making it difficult or impossible to vote or to have all votes counted equally. Consider, for example, the age-old partisan practice of gerrymandering, changing the shape of a congressional district to ensure your party's advantage. The term dates back to 1812, when Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry helped redistrict that state to benefit his party. One new district was so contorted it resembled the shape of a salamander, hence the term gerrymandering. 2 centuries later, the process is still the same. Former Labor Secretary Robert Reich explains.
Now here are 16 black dots and 12 white squares. If districts were not gerrymandered, they might look like this, and 3 out of 4 would have black dot majorities. But after gerrymandering, 3 out of 4 have white square majorities.
In 2010, savvy Republican strategists managed to reinvent the oldest political trick in the book, the gerrymander.
David Daley is the author of Rat Effed, the true story behind the secret plan to steal America's democracy.
In 2010, gerrymandering enters its steroids era. The Republicans plotted their return to power after Barack Obama's 2008 sweep through redistricting. The plan worked.
Gerrymandering has now become more extreme than ever, worsened by increasingly sophisticated data and map drawing techniques.
The technology makes it much more lethal.
The U.S. Supreme Court considers 2 gerrymandering cases this year, but rulings will come too late to affect the midterm elections. Instead, Americans in key states will vote again under gerrymandered maps that have proven resistant to change.
Mix that with a sophisticated political strategy, and you have a recipe for turning a side with fewer votes into a supermajority.
Besides extreme gerrymandering, other modern forms of voter suppression include targeted polling place closures, purging voter rolls, cross-checking, limiting registration and reducing early voting, disenfranchising felons, gutting the Voting Rights Act, and making up charges of voter fraud, leading to voter ID laws.
But voter ID laws are the new modern-day poll tax. They're not preventing fraud, they're preventing voting.
Although both major parties try to suppress votes for their opponents, Republicans in particular have cemented their power by making election laws more favorable to white, older, suburban and rural Americans.
These obstacles are put in the way mostly of voters of color, and that's the real issue. We have an apartheid election system.
It's taken generations of struggle to expand the promise of full citizenship, from the Reconstruction Amendments through women's suffrage, Native American suffrage, the Voting Rights Act and its extensions, the 26th Amendment, and beyond. We still create barriers to voting that exclude millions from the political process, as evidenced by a recent Kansas law now being challenged in court that requires would-be voters to prove they are U.S. citizens prior to registering.
This is a law that has been championed by Kansas's Secretary of State, Chris Kobach, and it's been absolutely devastating for voter registration in the state. About 1 in 7 people who applied to register to vote saw their registration applications rejected. One of the pernicious effects of this law is that it has made voter registration drives in the state of Kansas virtually impossible.
How can we cure the electoral dysfunction now plaguing us?
Kind of a catch-22. Yes.
Calling out voter theft wherever and whenever it occurs is one good idea.
What we have to do is stop the new trickery. And this takes us back to what Martin Luther King did in crossing the bridge at Selma over a half century ago. They didn't have the vote then. We got to take our vote back now.
America's history has been a continuing march toward greater voter equality, as Dr. King noted in his Give Us the Ballot speech before the Lincoln Memorial. Welcome back. I'd like to begin by looking at the issue of so-called partisan gerrymandering. Arthur Eisenberg, you've been involved in more than 20 cases presented to the Supreme Court, including the current gerrymandering cases. What can you tell us about your involvement and some of the issues under consideration in the cases being heard right now?
Well, you know, the Supreme Court has entertained 3 earlier gerrymandering cases. It seems to take one case every 10 years. And on each of those earlier occasions, the court has ultimately concluded that the claims challenging the gerrymandering process were too complicated and did not present judicially manageable standards.
So they affirmed the existing decisions?
They, in essence, affirmed the existing decisions or the existing districting arrangement. But in some instances, there was a mixed conclusion in terms of what the lower courts had done. But the courts basically concluded that, that the cases were not presented in a way that would allow for a recognition of what kind of gerrymandering is permissible and what is impermissible.
So was there anything different this time around?
Well, I hope things will be different, but I've always felt that the claims were made much too complicated than they need be. That there is a very simple way of thinking about gerrymandering, and I look first to an example of the state legislature sitting in Albany or Madison, Wisconsin, and fixing the voting machines, rigging the voting machines to dictate the outcome of the election, to favor one political party over another. If that were to occur, we would all know that there's something wrong.
Yeah.
And yet, and what is wrong with that is that in those circumstances, the state legislature, when it fixes the voting machines, is violating an obligation to remain neutral in its administration of elections. But the drawing of district lines to foreordain the outcome of an election, to dictate the outcome of an election, is no different. And in both instances, the legislature would be violating the principle of neutrality, the obligation to remain neutral in the administration of elections. It's a very simple principle.
But as you said, it's a simple principle. It may sound simple to all of us, but time and again, the court has said, no, we can't actually see a simple standard here. We can't actually see how to resolve this. So why is this so complicated? And is there a legislative fix? Judge Alito in the recent cases, I think, was the one who said that he couldn't see a fix, a legislative fix to the problem. Why is it so difficult? Deuel, do you want to come in on this? Why is it so hard?
You know, I think you've heard the Supreme Court justices say that, you know, you have to rely on this sort of sociological gobbledygook. But I think this time around we have real clear methods of measuring the ways in which gerrymandering has sort of distorted our election system. So I actually don't think that it's necessarily so hard, and I think that this time around we have a real opportunity for the Supreme Court to step in and finally sort of put an end to this rampant problem of gerrymandering in partisan ways. And I think that's particularly because, as was mentioned in the clip earlier, that there's been this change in technology and this real focus on trying to find manageable, understandable ways to measure gerrymandering's discriminatory effect on partisans.
Well, could you have, I mean, I think it was Justice Kennedy said, could you have just a standard? Could you have a benchmark that you could tell whether people were violating it, Donita?
Well, I think that what we're looking at right now is that we're looking at extreme partisan gerrymandering. And while we've had gerrymandering over the years, this is extreme. And I think once it becomes extreme, we have to have a standard. Because if in fact we have what we have in this country is a Browning now of this country. And this is really impacting those individuals who really want to participate in the election. But if you participate and you find, like you found in Wisconsin, where less than, where the one party got less than 50% of the vote, but held a predominant number of the seats in the legislature, it really, people start to question, like, well, why am I really participating? And what I'm excited about and happy about is that people are now talking about redistricting and gerrymandering. And before, that was really just kind of something that was kept outside, and it was done, under the auspices of legislatures or whomever. But I think now, people are invested. They're starting to listen, and so programs like this, where we can have an opportunity to talk about, and the court to hear people say, this is extreme. I mean, this is really gone beyond what the norm is.
You agree?
Well, I think we ought to be adopting a legal claim which inquires into the motivation of the legislature. We do this in other areas of the law. It's not so hard to do it here. And the First Amendment commands governmental neutrality, as I was saying before. It commands it in the context of government regulating access to a public forum, to a park. The government can't favor one speaker over another. It can't choose Republicans over Democrats, Democrats over Republicans. That same principle ought to apply here in administering the election and in for the court to review an election by looking at the motive to see if the government acted neutrally, and if they acted out of partisan self-interest, if they were favoring one political party over another, if they were favoring one incumbent, one candidate over another. In all of those circumstances, there would be an impermissible motivation which would give rise to a claim of impermissible racial.
It still requires looking at case-by-case basis, though. I mean, there's probably some people watching and said, why can't you just have those nice square districts that, that Robert Reich drew on the board?
Well, I think Iowa does do that, and there is a movement towards these commissions which try to remove the process from the legislature, who is the legislature being the most self-interested entity in the redistricting process.
I mean, we'd still have to deal with segregation of housing and all sorts of different things, but that would that not just be a simple solution, Donita?
Well, I do think that would be, a very easy solution depending on who gets on those commissions and how we go about selecting. I mean, we've always got to look at that. I know that Ohio just passed legislation a couple years ago where they have a commission now drawing the congressional districts, and they have a ballot initiative this year that will have individuals selected to draw the state legislature. I think California seemed to have been very successful, but then Florida came under attack there, in terms of how they were now drawing districts. So, I think that we have to look at anything that is a possibility before we discard it, because we've got to do something to change
really.
this.
I mean, this goes back to this bigger question, I suppose, of both parties do this. We call it sort of, I think we say, it's so-called partisan, because it's not partisan in the sense that there's one party against, it's both parties do that. And, I have some sympathy for the justices who say, I don't see legislators ever actually changing the way this is done, because they're too invested in the outcome. Is it possible that there is an outsider movement, as it were, shifting that today? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that it's really important to consider these solutions that California and other states have considered, like these commissions where citizens are selected and are made a part of the process. But I think one thing, just in the question of sort of how you create these districts, people often think like, well, why don't you just draw, nice squares and that will solve everything?
Like
but
I did.
You have to remember that there are things like the Voting Rights Act, which requires that African Americans and other people of color have representation, one person, one vote. That maybe a nice square won't necessarily work out. And so I think it's important to have standards, both whatever the Supreme Court does with these decisions and also the bedrock standards that they've already developed, and keep those in mind whenever gets set up, whether it's a commission or just guidelines for a legislature, so that they know not to do this, or at least not do it in the extreme way that they've done in the last 10 or 20 years.
2016 was the first election taking place outside, or out from under the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. Would you be in favor of returning to the kind of pre-clearance process, and could you explain to people what that is?
Absolutely. So the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 of it, was a provision that was enacted in 1965. And as a part of the act, what essentially was that states that had a history of racial discrimination, like in New York, but primarily in the South, had to ask permission from the federal government first before they enacted any voting change. So that would be something as small as a polling place change to as big as a statewide redistricting. And if the DOJ or a three-judge court found that the change was discriminatory, then they could block it before it went into effect. And so I think the Legal Defense Fund and other civil rights organizations have long been in favor of restoring the Voting Rights Act, which unfortunately that particular portion of it was struck down in 2013 by the Supreme Court. And so one thing that we could do to sort of address this problem, at least in the context of race, is to restore the Voting Rights Act to its full strength, and that's something that Congress has to do, but unfortunately has not.
Arthur, where do you think that stands as even an option?
Well, I think it's an option that we should press for. I think it's vital to eliminate the systemic patterns of discrimination against minorities that has historically existed and continues to exist in this country.
So maybe it could be reintroduced and just cover all the states.
Well, that's basically, I think, what the Supreme Court basically said when they struck it down, is that there were states that they believe should have been covered and that were not covered. For instance, Ohio. Ohio has a horrible history of voter suppression. And so, I mean, certainly to be more inclusive, Because at this point, not having Section 5 means we have Section 2, which thank God we have that piece, but
what does Section 2 do?
Section 2 is basically it's for laws that are passed or bills that are passed or procedures put in place that are discriminatory, that actually discriminate against people of color. Mm-hmm. And so Section 2 is helpful, but it's burdensome. It's expensive because you have to litigate it. You have to have the injury happen first. And so whereas with Section 5, as soon as the system was put into place, right, you could then go to Department of Justice. You can't do that under Section 2, and I think that makes it very, very difficult to be able to challenge these type of voter suppression type of laws.
Yeah. So the Supreme Court's decisions on these cases will come out probably in June. Is there anything they could decide that would affect this year's midterms in November? Anybody?
It's possible in the Wisconsin case where the court was moving forward and trying to come up with a remedy before it was appealed, that hopefully something could occur, but given that there's such a small amount of time between June and the November election, I think it's probably unlikely that something will directly affect 2018, but there's obviously 2020 and all the elections thereafter.
And things that have been going on not just in the court. I'm thinking of Pennsylvania has a case. I mean, tell us where that stands, Pennsylvania, North Carolina.
So in Pennsylvania, there was a recent decision by the state Supreme Court in which they eliminated these very partisan gerrymanders. There was an image in the video earlier that showed Goofy kicking Donald, which is sort of the most extreme gerrymander in Pennsylvania, and the state Supreme Court struck that down and redrew the districts, and for 2018 those new districts will be in place.
So where does this part of this conversation go next? I'm hearing we need movement building and we need kind of national attention to this issue, but maybe that's happening. Are the voters that are coming into this world of voting right now, I'm thinking of the millennials, the young people who are showing an interest in getting getting involved in voting at least, and maybe running for office. Is redistricting an issue for them?
Well, I think we have to restore confidence in our electoral system, and I think the most effective way to do that would be to use the legal system to prohibit directly and with judicial supervision the practice of parties favoring one party over another, favoring one candidate over another, having the legislature with its finger on the electoral scale is wrong, and it should be corrected, and we need to restore confidence in that.
And I should have probably asked you this before, but you actually argued these cases. You've been there in the court. What's the atmosphere like? I mean, this is the bedrock of our democracy.
Well, I argued one case in the Supreme Court which I thought I should have won. It involved the state of Hawaii that prohibited individuals from casting a write-in ballot. And Hawaii was at the time a state that was dominated by the Democrats. And so voters would walk into the voting booth and they would be presented often only with a Democrat running for office because the Republicans didn't even bother to put up a candidate. And they would not even be given the choice of saying none of the above. And we challenged that and lost that in the United States Supreme Court.
Shocking, I'm assuming.
I was shocked.
Yeah, I bet. In a moment, we're going to take a look at how unfounded claims of fraud, trumped up charges that millions somehow voted illegally, have been used by Republicans to push for voter ID laws aimed at poor, young, and African American voters, all likely to support Democrats. I'm Laura Flanders, and you're watching a joint production of Free Speech TV and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Stay tuned. Welcome back. I'd like to begin the next part of our discussion by asking Deuel Ross to share what he learned while challenging racially discriminatory voter photo ID laws in Alabama, Texas, and Arkansas. Deuel, you argue that these laws impose significant and disproportionate burdens on African Americans and Latino voters. How so, and why?
Well, starting with the Texas case, Texas enacted this law in 2011 and did so in a way that, they created barriers specifically for African Americans and Latino voters. They chose forms of ID that were acceptable for voting that African Americans and Latinos were less likely to have.
Like what?
Like a concealed handgun license. They said that that was okay for voting, but they said that a student ID or a government employee ID was not okay for voting. Both types of ID are more likely to be held by African Americans and Latinos. And I think it's also important to remember, people often think like everyone has photo ID, like everyone has a driver's license, everyone has this thing, but there's a large segment of our population who don't have these kind of IDs. One of the people that we represented in our case was a woman who was born in the Jim Crow South in Louisiana who had a birth certificate, but the name on the birth certificate completely mismatched from the name that she had gone by her entire life, and she had to pay thousands of dollars an attorney in Louisiana to just get her birth certificate changed in order to get ID in order to vote in Texas. And so, people who don't have those means, who live on, dollars a day, don't have the ability to drive 30, 40, 50 miles, get an ID, and come back and use it to vote, and often didn't need to for a very long time.
So where do these stand now?
In Texas, this law has been struck down multiple times, but because of the complications with the Voting Rights Act and the changes that the Supreme Court enacted in 2013, it's only in this 2016 election cycle in which a remedy was finally enacted there. In Alabama, our case was unfortunately recently thrown out in January, and so now that's on appeal to the Federal Court of Appeals. And in that case, it was particularly interesting because not only was there evidence that over 100,000 voters lacked the ID that was required to vote, but also that the legislature had intentionally discriminated. One of the legislators who had pushed this bill for years actually said that the bill would undermine the black power structure in the state. Another legislator who sponsored the bill had called black voters aborigines, and so these people were not secretive about their reasons for supporting these bills.
And we mentioned Chris Kobach in the role-in at the beginning of this show. What has been his particular contribution to this picture?
So Chris Kobach is the Kansas Secretary of State who for a long time has been pushing voter ID laws and also documentary proof of citizenship bills. So under federal law, if someone wants to register to vote, all they have to do is essentially sign an affidavit saying that they swear under penalty of perjury that they are a United States citizen. But Chris Kobach has pushed this false story that there are thousands or millions of people who are undocumented citizens or are not citizens who are trying to register to vote. And so he's pushed these bills that essentially require someone when they're going to register to vote to show a passport, to show a birth certificate, a document that someone, if you're going to the grocery store and someone asks you to register to vote, you're not going to have on hand. And so in Kansas, as the roll-in showed, a third of voters have been rejected because of this discriminatory law.
And the penalties if you were to show up with something that wasn't, wasn't up to date or correct, or that they could say was fraudulent?
So, there are extreme penalties for voter fraud. A woman in Texas was recently convicted of voter fraud just because she had attempted to register to vote, even though because she was a person who had a felony conviction, who was on parole, and she believed that she could register to vote. No one had told her that she couldn't, and it was only after they decided to prosecute her that that this was used against her. And in Alabama, when people try to apply for a voter ID card, so you have to swear under penalty of a felony that you don't have any of the forms of ID that are acceptable for voting. So there are very stringent.
So if you find it later, you've somehow lied.
Exactly, you've somehow lied, and you're potentially liable, can be convicted of a felony and can be thrown in jail for it. So these laws are not only does voter fraud not exist in measurable amounts, but these laws are also very draconian in terms of their criminal punishments that can be attached to the voter ID laws and also voter fraud laws.
To clear up this part of the question up, Arthur, our president says millions of people, undocumented people, voted who shouldn't, echoing many of what Chris Kobach tweeted. Trump has made this a major issue and he hasn't backed off yet. Right. What's the truth?
Well, voter fraud is infinitesimal in this country. There's virtually no voter fraud. The real problem in this country is that we don't have enough people voting, not that we have too many people pretending that there's somebody else and voting. So it's a phony issue, and it's transparently phony.
Coming to you, Donita, we've talked a bit about the law. We've talked about the lack of voter fraud. We've talked about the passage of these kinds of restrictions. I'm wondering about the fear effect, like just the scare effect, whether your state has or hasn't passed this stuff, whether you believe or don't believe Donald Trump. Is it measurable, the fear that people feel? Do they have the right to vote? Did they do the right thing? Do they have the right credentials?
I believe that the more instances we see where there are these allegations of voter fraud, the more times that we see these laws being passed that chill the vote, actually it impacts individuals going to the polls. Yeah. After the North Carolina case, one of the things that we argued is that this monster voter suppression bill was going to chill the vote in 2014. And while as it turns out in 2014, there was a bit of a bump, but when you looked back at 2012, which was 2010, which was the last midterm election, you could see the difference. Yeah. It was a significant difference. So, we should be in the business of making sure that people can register to vote and vote. We should not be in the business of making it more difficult for people to be able to participate. And yes, it does chill the vote every time we hear these stories.
And how did people do it in other countries? I mean, I remember growing up in the UK, I received my voter ID, I think, with my 18th birthday. Simple as that. Anybody want to address that? Or Arthur want to go?
We fancy ourselves the great democracy of the world, and yet when you look at voter turnout among developed nations, we are among the lowest.
What about this arcane process of giving people requirements before they can register, making it a challenge to get the vote?
And the numbers are stunning with respect to the difference between states that employ cumbersome voter registration laws and states that let people simply walk in and vote. Minnesota has a walk-in and vote system. They don't experience a great deal of voter fraud. People show up on election day, they present some identification. 75% of the eligible electorate vote in Minnesota. Most other states in this country hover around, with cumbersome voter registration laws, hover between 50 and 60%.
Yeah, I think the Brennan Society actually took a look at democracies around the world, 16 of them. Only 4 didn't make it completely automatic, and of course we were one of the 4. Deuel, where do we go from here on this topic? I mean, with respect to these voter ID laws, are we going to see more or fewer? It seems like we're still on the increase, on the slope up.
I'm hopeful that if we can restore the Voting Rights Act, if some of these more onerous laws are struck down in the federal court systems, that we'll see fewer of these very onerous and strict voter ID laws like we have in places like Texas and Alabama. But unfortunately, because they're sort of, at this point, there's not a whole lot standing in the way of legislatures that want to manipulate the electorate, want to make it whiter or more conservative. There's not a whole lot that can be done except for challenging these laws after the fact and hoping that they work out.
I mean, you did mention Alabama, and we saw an interesting result in the Senate race there, of course, last year with the election of Doug Jones. One of the elements that went into that, it seems to me, was yes, we had these onerous voter ID laws that were passed, but we also had felon re-enfranchisement. Exactly. So can we talk about that a little bit? I mean, it's a long process, but it does have the promise of bringing hundreds of thousands of voters into the system.
You're absolutely right. I think at this point in this country, we have about 6.1 million people who cannot vote as a result of a felony conviction. In what we are seeing in Florida is a ballot initiative that has been placed on, this year, that will restore the right to those some individuals with felony convictions, and at least 1.4 million people. This is something that's bubbling up. We just had a case in Louisiana that would potentially restore the right to vote to individuals on parole and probation. New Jersey is also looking at this. So all over throughout the country, this is a huge voting block. And those individuals, the other thing that we have found is that the more likely that the sooner you are integrated back into society, the less likely, that you are actually going to go back into that system. And so, we need to start to think about what could happen if we had a democracy where everyone could participate. And that we just don't have. We have too many barriers for too many people, for too many reasons, and it's historical.
Yeah, I mean, we often talk about apathy and people failing, the large number of people that don't vote. Sometimes I look at this conversation and I think it's amazing as many people vote as do. In Alabama, just to focus there for a second, that was a 20,000 vote margin that won that Senate race for the Democrat, surprising everybody. There's a man there who'd been working on felon reenfranchisement, Pastor Glasgow, Kenneth Glasgow, who says that he knows of 10,000 of those votes that were reenfranchised felons that he had been involved in helping to vote. When he describes what was required to not just pass the legislation, but to get people informed that their voting rights had been restored, that they could vote, that it would be all right for them to vote, it's a monumental task. Is it enough to do what, for example, Governor Cuomo in New York did recently and say he's going to allow parolees to vote?
Well, it's interesting because in Alabama, where they did decide to re-enfranchise a portion of the electorate, one of the things that the state actually refused to do, probably because they were concerned about an upsurge in these people voting, was to affirmatively mail folks who had tried to register to vote but had been rejected prior because of their felony. And so one of the things that we're seeing is, yes, states are sort of in some ways liberalizing their laws, but in other ways, states like Alabama are not doing enough to actually inform people that now they can vote.
Yeah, I think it took people like Pastor Glasgow going jailhouse to jailhouse and court to court.
Right, and trying to inform people. LDF did a mass mailing to explain to people that now you can vote. We worked with local organizations like the NAACP and Greater Birmingham Ministries and other groups just to tell people that, hey, now you can vote in a way that the state had, even though they passed this law, refused to do.
I'm coming back to you, Arthur, with the big kind of, this is such a macro problem. Why is it so complicated? Why does our democracy operate this way? I mean, it makes I feel like we should all have our hair on fire as we have this conversation if we actually want to call the United States a democracy, if we want to talk about voting at all.
Well, I keep coming back to the point that I made earlier, which was that we have to address the problem of self-interest on the part of the political parties. And we've put them in charge of regulating our elections. We have to insist that they behave as neutral administrators and not act out of their own self-interest. I mean, we have, for example, in New York, a system where we think that we are protecting voters by having the Republicans and the Democrats watch each other. Well, they may watch each other, but if one party perceives of itself as at a disadvantage by virtue of any reform, they will effectively veto that reform. And so we don't see the kinds of reforms through the political process that we should see. And I think we have to rely upon the courts to engage in a serious inquiry as to whether the parties are behaving as legislators in ways that advantage one political party over another. And I think the courts have to finally say that's impermissible.
Yeah, and does it really make sense to leave this up to each state and county and district?
Advancement Project has been advocating for a fundamental right to vote in our U.S. Constitution.
Thank you.
We do not have a fundamental right to vote, and most people would be surprised to know that. And so what we need, you started the program and you talked about the different systems throughout the country. If we had a fundamental right to vote in this country, we would have uniform systems. There would be one law or one rule that determines whether people with felony convictions can vote. In terms of voter registration, who could register, what they would need to register. And so, when we start to think about, right away we think about freedom of speech. We think about U.S. Constitution Amendment, First Amendment. We talk about guns. We think about Second Amendment. We need to start talking about a fundamental right to vote in this country, or we will never have a democracy where everyone can participate equally. I just don't see it.
Deuel, you want to come in on that?
No, I totally agree that there's a problem with the fact that there's not a constitutional amendment that directly protects the right to vote. And I think a problem with that is that that leaves Congress sort of at a disadvantage in some ways of dealing with these problems. It's why there's a Voting Rights Act that protects African Americans, but not necessarily a Voting Rights Act that broadly protects the entire electorate, or that defines, when, whether there's going to be early voting, whether or not certain people with certain felony convictions can vote. All these things, I think, are absent because there isn't this fundamental guarantee of the right to vote in the Constitution.
Our work is cut out for us. Well, we will be back in a moment to look at some other forms of voter suppression and some possible solutions you can check out yourself and get involved in. I'm Laura Flanders. You're watching a joint production of Free Speech TV and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Stay with us. Welcome back. Let's begin with Donita Judge. Your organization, Advancement Project, is a racial justice group. Along with gerrymandering and voter ID laws, what are some other racially discriminatory voter suppression tactics you have your eye on, and what can we do about them?
I think right now one of the biggest areas that we are concerned about is voter purging. Before the Supreme Court right now, we're waiting on a decision in a case called Husted versus APRI. It's a case out of Ohio that voters are being removed from the voter roll solely for not voting. And we believe that that is really, that is in conflict with the National Voter Registration Act that was passed in 1993. That the whole purpose is to register voters, to have more voters registered on the rolls. Depending on when the court rules and how the court rules, it could have a severe impact in 2018, because if it's a very narrow decision that focuses only on Ohio, then we could have significant numbers of voters purged. If it's a broad decision that just allows this supplemental process to remove voters for solely not voting, then it could have impact nationwide.
So
in
who's
terms
getting
of 2018.
purged? Is people who are registered but not showing up to vote?
Yes, solely for that reason. And we know how hard it is to register after having this conversation. So once you get registered, now you have to worry about potentially being removed. If in fact there's a notice sent, this notice is sent to you, you don't respond to the notice, you may not have gotten the notice.
Maybe there isn't a candidate you want to vote for.
Right, that's exactly right. I mean, this is a democracy. We do have an opportunity to choose whether we want to participate or sit out. But to remove people who do not vote is purely it, and we believe it's also in conflict with the the NVRA, as well as the Help America Vote Act, which came about after the debacle in Florida in 2000, and basically, was to help Americans vote.
That was the voting that you could, when you were getting your driver's license, made it easier to apply for a voter registration, right?
Right. The Help America Vote Act. And so, what can we do about it? I mean, well, certainly. We're litigating this, but in the meantime, it's extremely important to tell voters, it's not enough to register anymore. Check your registration, verify, make sure that you're on that voter roll before the voter registration deadline, which in most states is 3 weeks to a month out.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I think that you have to be proactive in this if you want to really participate.
I mean, there is a danger, isn't there, in this period, this electoral period running up to the midterm elections in the fall, of thinking, well, there's this demographic wave. People keep talking about a blue wave. It's millennials, it's new Americans, it's people who are paying attention since Donald Trump got elected. A wave isn't going to do it if the wave has to get through these sort of sluice gates of obstacles. Do you have concerns about people sitting back and thinking, well, this is just going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to realize that one, the Democrats do these things too, right? So here in New York, where the state has failed to enact things like early voting or same-day registration, I think that obviously has an impact on people's ability to vote, and particularly people of color's ability to vote. And we've seen cutbacks on those things in other states, and the fact that some states don't even have that is obviously a barrier for people who may turn out and vote, but for various reasons, partisans of all stripes don't want to come out and vote.
What did happen in New York recently? What did Governor Cuomo do?
Governor Cuomo restored the right to vote for those who are on parole. Under current practice, or prior to the issuance of the executive order, individuals were restored the franchise at the conclusion of their full sentence, which meant that they could not vote while they were on parole. And Governor Cuomo has now issued an executive order allowing parolees to vote. The precise procedures for informing parolees that they are now entitled to vote on an individual by individual basis, which we hope will come, have not been developed as yet, I think.
And was I right in perceiving pushback from people who said, but this only applies to this class? It's not in perpetuity? It doesn't actually change the rules categorically?
Well, it's an executive order, so it presumably would survive the tenure of Governor Cuomo in office. And if he is reelected.
And he's running for re-election, so he wants more voters out there. So, well, let's talk. I mean, we could talk about cynical, craven reasons to make change, but maybe we want to talk about well-intentioned change-making. There has been some encouraging news also in the last 6 months or so. I'm thinking about New Jersey, for example. You want to talk about what happened there under Governor Bill Murphy?
New Jersey enacted a registration law to make it easier for people in order to register to vote. Other states like California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, all these states have passed new laws that have expanded the right to vote, have made it easier for people to vote in their homes, and automatic registration laws. All of these laws, I think, are sort of a step in the right direction that whenever the Congress decides to get back around to this, they can look at amending things like the Help America Vote Act and the National Voter Registration Act to make it easier for people to be registered to vote and stay registered.
The Democracy Act in New Jersey does, I think, make it automatically that you're registered.
Yes, actually, the automatic voter registration in New Jersey is if you show up at the DMV, you are automatically registered, and my belief is that they're attempting to expand it to other public service agencies because, you know, disproportionately people of color are likely not to have driver's license and not to potentially to go to the DMV, and so having those other public service agencies will certainly be more inclusive for people of color to participate.
Well, are there other things we could be doing in that sort of way to make things easier?
Sure. I think that we could be pushing for a fundamental right to vote in this, in this country to make things a lot easier for individuals who, you know, very uniform, very transparent, very open.
I mean, we do an awful lot of things by the computer now, by the internet. What about online voting? What about satellite voting?
Online voting, I'm just still a little skeptical after what we know from the 2016 election. So I'm not quite there yet with the online voting. It potentially is a wave. I think I'm going to stand back from that.
Maybe it's not the right year to talk about doing more things online having to do with elections. Have we done everything we need to do around civil rights? I mean, I remember doing a report a few years ago about the continuing struggle in Montana, for example, to make sure that Native Americans were registered to vote in federal elections, that they were informed, made possible to actually get to the polling places. Do we feel like there's still work to be done at basic levels like that?
There's always work to be done. The whole history of the Voting Rights Act is that the Voting Rights Act comes in 1965, gives blacks in the South, blacks around the country, the right to vote, and the localities, particularly in the South, develop these mechanisms called at-large voting, which serves to dilute the minority voting opportunities. The fight for voting rights has been an historic fight of action and reaction. It will inevitably continue to some degree. We have to press as hard as we can to expand the franchise, to make us a true democracy. But I don't think we'll ever cure the problem of resistance.
Yeah, I mean, we often are told that voter intimidation is a tactic that went out in that period with Jim Crow. Not true. I mean, we have seen actually accelerated rates of simple voter intimidation, people being encouraged to self-nominate as polling booth or polling station police. People in hijabs, in the Muslim headscarf, being intimidated, sent away from the polling booth in lots of the elections last fall. What can movement groups do to address that sort of societal conflict around voting, which might or might not be changed by changing the law. Deuel, Donita?
I think one thing that at least LDF has tried to do, and I know other groups have tried to do, is obviously confront this on the ground, is to have volunteers and people on the ground monitoring these things and to address them at the polls and also beforehand. And then when that doesn't work, President Trump before the 2016 election said that he encouraged people to do what you're describing, to go to the polls, to watch out for people in certain communities in Philadelphia and St. Louis, and to make sure that certain people weren't voting, right? And then obviously set up this voter fraud commission sort of based on that idea. And so when it fails to go on the ground and try to address the problems at the polls, there's always litigation that obviously ended that voter fraud commission and other forms of intimidation that have been tried.
You could say it was too late.
Yeah.
Right. I almost think that once the problem gets to the outside of the polls, it's too late.
Yeah.
And so we advocate, certainly in terms of on the ground, is that people volunteer to be poll workers. I mean, poll worker, being inside the polls, that's where the action is. Yeah. And so that's where you can make decisions as to whether or not a person should be able to vote. And and I really advocate for all of the emerging voters to really become engaged at that level, being at the polls, but because the technology is kind of in some ways passing by those who've been there for 40, 50 years, some of our other poll workers. But really getting engaged on that level, I think you can stop a lot of problems before they actually start.
That reminds me, though, of the scene that often greets one when one goes to vote. Poor old machines you've seen for decades, people who are volunteering in buildings that are closed for the day because it's not a day off. I mean, it does speak volumes to the seriousness with which we treat our democracy. Maybe it speaks to the seriousness with which we want to discourage people from voting.
Well, certainly the Help America Vote Act was actually to give a lot of jurisdictions new machines. Yeah. Some of those jurisdictions didn't take it. They turned away. The wave is certainly electronic machines. We have to wonder, and question whether those are the safest way to vote. Yeah. But if we are going to go that way, the poll workers that we have had for many, many years, those who've come out and have now are retiring, they need to be replaced, and so we need people to be in those polling places. And what better group than the group that's all of the new voters that are standing up now.
Do you hold out hope for the millennials who are right now talking, particularly those who are focused on the question of gun control, coming up saying that they are going to get involved, they are going to vote? I mean, we're talking in spring, it's many months to go. Do you hold out hope that this will become an issue for them and that they will get their voices heard?
I do. I think, we saw the mass movement of students who marched on Washington, who are walking out all over their schools. I think that these are young people who are just coming into themselves and who are excited to finally go to the polls and vote. And so I'm confident that they'll do everything that they can to actually do so. And I agree with Donita that these folks need to get more involved with becoming poll workers, becoming involved in not just bringing themselves to the polls, but bringing other people to the polls. And I think once that happens, that's a real, in some ways, cure for this voter suppression, is people, not just lawyers, but average everyday people getting involved and understanding the mechanics of their democracy and helping others overcome barriers to voting.
Arthur?
But we have to end the legal barriers, or certainly reduce the legal barriers. And we have to finally, at long last, adopt walk-in and vote, not only in states like Minnesota, but in New York and New Jersey and the urban areas as well. The pre-registration requirements, when people are less engaged in the electoral process, less engaged in the campaign, only to discover later on the eve of the election that they hadn't registered, continues to be an unnecessary barrier. So I think that's important. I'm hopeful as well for the millennials, but we have to make it much easier for them to exercise their franchise.
Am I living in a dream world to imagine that we might have a day off for voting sometime in our lifetime?
We've advocated for it. We certainly believe that it should happen. I don't know whether it's a dream world or whether there's others would say, oh, that's a nightmare. But certainly I would advocate, and I'm sure Advancement Project would advocate for that for people to have that time, because certainly in areas where people lack transportation. I mean, in New York, it may be a little easier, but in certain areas, rural areas, there's the transportation is just not there. People's economic issues, whether you work in do service work and you are unable to get to the polls during the time, there's a lot of barriers that may not be intentional, but they do impact people's ability to participate. So.
I think as much as we cover the challenges, we also need, as you said, to cover the advantage or the excitement of getting involved in the process. When we cover those long lines and we cover the challenges, I wonder whether we're discouraging people from showing up. And certainly long lines in some states have been an impediment for people who only had an hour off for a lunch break or something to go and vote, right?
No, certainly that's true. And I think, in the absence of getting a national holiday for Election Day, I think, again, just something like an early voting system in which people can vote on Saturday, Sunday, the Monday before the election. They have some flexibility in choosing when to vote, unlike states like Alabama or even New York, where, voting occurs on this Tuesday from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And if you can't get time off from work, if you can't find someone to watch your kids, then you're kind of out of luck. And so I think that's really important to look for new solutions to make it as easy as possible for people who do face barriers like transportation, childcare, work schedules that keep them from voting. And I think early voting, same-day registration, mail-in voting are all ways that make it easier for people to vote.
If there was one thing you'd want people to do after watching this program, what would it be?
I would tell people after watching this program to check to determine when your last day to register to vote, and once you register to vote, before you go to vote, verify that your registration has gone through and that you are eligible.
And Arthur?
Vote.
Deuel.
I would say contact Congress and ask them to amend and restore the Voting Rights Act, and also contact your local legislators and ask them to enact and support local bills that expand the right to vote and make it easier to vote.
All right. Thank you all for your years of litigation, organizing, and advocacy on behalf of all of our electoral rights and this democracy. Arthur Eisenberg, for many years at the New York Civil Liberties Union. Donita Judge with Advancement Project. Deuel Ross at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Thank you all for coming on the program. From the Manhattan Neighborhood Network studios at El Barrio Firehouse in East Harlem, New York, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for watching this edition of our series, Elections 2018, The Progressive Path Forward.